Let me ask you something. What happens when the largest invasion fleet ever assembled in Asia, carrying 40,000 Mongol and Korean warriors who have conquered half the known world, lands on the shores of Japan to face samurai who have never fought anyone but each other? What happens when composite bows that can punch through armor at 200 yards meet warriors trained in individual combat and honor duels? What happens when the greatest military machine in history, fresh off destroying the Song dynasty and subjugating Korea, meets an island nation that's been isolated for centuries, fighting its own civil wars, completely unprepared for what's coming? The answer came in November 1274, on the beaches and fields of northern Kyushu, in a series of desperate engagements that culminated at a place called Torikai-Gata. This isn't a story about noble samurai defeating barbarian hordes through superior virtue. This is about Japanese warriors learning in real time that everything they knew about warfare was obsolete, adapting under fire, using terrain and desperation to survive against an enemy that should have crushed them in the first engagement. No romanticism, no Hollywood samurai mystique. Just the reality of what happened when two completely different military cultures collided, with the fate of Japan hanging in the balance. If this story teaches you something new, if you walk away understanding the Mongol invasions of Japan better than you did 10 minutes ago, hit that like button and drop a comment. We are here for real history, the kind that doesn't simplify or sanitize. Now let's go back to 1274, to an island nation that's about to face the most terrifying military force on the planet. The Mongol Empire in 1274 was the largest contiguous land empire in human history. Genghis Khan had died in 1227, but his descendants had continued his conquests. The empire stretched from Korea to Hungary, from Siberia to the borders of India. Millions of people lived under Mongol rule. The Mongols had conquered the Jin dynasty in northern China, the Khwarezmian Empire in Central Asia, the Kievan Rus principalities, and most recently, the southern Song dynasty in China. They were unstoppable. Their military system was the most advanced in the world. Mongol armies moved faster, communicated better, and adapted more quickly than any opponent they faced. They used composite bows that could kill at 300 yards, cavalry tactics that could encircle and destroy forces twice their size, and psychological warfare that terrified enemies into surrender before battles even began. By 1274, the Mongol Empire was ruled by Kublai Khan, grandson of Genghis, who'd recently proclaimed himself Emperor of China and established the Yuan dynasty. Kublai controlled China, Mongolia, Korea, and was looking for new conquests. His eyes turned east, toward the Japanese archipelago. Japan in 1274 was a different world entirely. The country had been in a state of civil war for decades. The emperor in Kyoto was a figurehead with religious authority but no political power. Real control was held by the Kamakura shogunate, a military government established in 1185 after the Genpei War. The shogun, technically the military commander serving the emperor, was actually the ruler. The reigning shogun was a child. Real power was held by the shikken, the regent, a man named Hojo Tokumune. Tokumune was only 23 years old in 1274, but he'd been regent since he was 18. He was smart, capable, and about to face the greatest crisis in Japanese history. Japanese warfare in 1274 was ritualized, personal, and completely unsuited for what was coming. Samurai combat was based on individual honor. When two armies met, champions would ride out, announce their lineage and accomplishments, challenge worthy opponents to single combat, and fight duels while the armies watched. Battles were decided by a series of these individual combats, not by coordinated mass tactics. Samurai were expert horsemen and archers, but they fought for personal glory and family honor, not as units executing coordinated maneuvers. Their armor was elaborate, designed to look impressive and identify the wearer's status. Their primary weapons were the bow and the tachi, a long curved sword. They prided themselves on martial skills, courage, and adherence to a code of honor that would later be codified as Bushido. This system worked perfectly well for Japanese civil wars, where both sides understood and followed the same rules. Against the Mongols, it was suicidal. The Mongols didn't care about honor duels. They didn't care about individual challenges. They fought as units, using coordinated tactics, flanking maneuvers, and overwhelming firepower. They used weapons the Japanese had never seen, including explosive bombs. They were going to teach the samurai a brutal lesson in modern warfare. Let's talk about how this war started. Kublai Khan sent his first embassy to Japan in 1268, demanding submission. The message was clear: acknowledge Mongol supremacy, send tribute, or face invasion. The Japanese court debated for months. Some argued for accommodation. The Mongols were invincible, everyone knew that. Resistance was suicide. Others, including Hojo Tokimune, argued for defiance. Japan had never been conquered by a foreign power. Submitting to barbarian demands was unthinkable. The Japanese sent no reply. Kublai sent another embassy in 1271. Again, no reply. He sent a third in 1272, threatening war if Japan didn't submit. The Japanese executed the Mongol envoys. This was Tokimune's decision. Execute the ambassadors, make it clear that Japan would rather fight than submit, and prepare for war. It was a bold move from a 20-year-old regent, and it sealed Japan's fate. War was coming. Kublai Khan ordered the invasion in 1274. He assembled a fleet in Korea, which the Mongols had conquered a few years earlier. The invasion force would consist of Mongol cavalry, Mongol and Chinese infantry, and Korean sailors. The fleet was built by Korean shipwrights, using Korean timber, conscripting Korean labor. The Koreans didn't want this war, but they were subjects of the Mongol Empire. They had no choice. The invasion fleet numbered around 900 ships, carrying approximately 40,000 men. This included 15,000 Mongol and Chinese troops and 25,000 Korean soldiers and sailors. The ships were a mix of large Chinese-style junks and smaller Korean vessels. They carried horses for the Mongol cavalry, siege equipment, supplies, and weapons the Japanese had never encountered. The invasion plan was straightforward. Cross the Korean Strait, land on the northern coast of Kyushu, the southernmost of Japan's main islands, establish a beachhead, overwhelm local resistance, and march inland. The Mongols expected minimal resistance. Japan was divided by civil war. The samurai, for all their reputation, had never faced a professional army. This should be easy. On November 2nd, 1274, the Mongol fleet departed Korea and sailed for Japan. The crossing took several days, but the sea was relatively calm. On November 19th, the fleet approached Tsushima Island, a small island halfway between Korea and Kyushu. Tsushima was defended by about 80 samurai under a commander named So Sukekuni. When So saw the Mongol fleet, hundreds of ships covering the horizon, he knew he was looking at his death, but he also knew his duty. Delay the invaders, buy time for Kyushu to prepare, die with honor. So and his 80 samurai rode out to meet the Mongol landing force. It was a massacre. The Mongols landed thousands of troops, formed disciplined units, and advanced in formation. The samurai charged, expecting individual combat. Instead, they were met with massed archery. Mongol composite bows fired in volleys, not individual shots. Arrows came in clouds, not one at a time. The samurai armor, designed to stop individual arrows from medium range, was penetrated by multiple impacts from short range. Horses were killed. Riders were shot down before they could close. So Sukekuni and all 80 of his samurai were killed in a matter of hours. The Mongols captured Tsushima, slaughtered or enslaved the civilian population, and used the island as a staging point. A few days later, they did the same to Iki Island, another small island closer to Kyushu. The garrison at Iki, about 100 samurai, resisted and were annihilated. Now the Mongols had a clear path to Kyushu. The samurai on Kyushu had received some warning. Refugees from Tsushima had escaped in fishing boats, bringing news of the invasion. The shogunate in Kamakura had been preparing defenses for months, but Kyushu was large, and nobody knew exactly where the Mongols would land. The defense was organized around local samurai families who controlled territories across the island. These families had their own retainers, their own armies, and their own rivalries. Coordinating them was difficult. The Mongol fleet approached the coast of Kyushu on November 19th and 20th, 1274. The primary landing was at Hakata Bay, a large natural harbor on the northern coast. Hakata was the main port city in northern Kyushu, a commercial center, relatively wealthy and undefended. The Mongols landed thousands of troops and immediately established a beachhead. The initial Japanese response was chaotic. Local samurai forces from nearby territories rode to meet the invaders, but they arrived piecemeal, uncoordinated, each unit acting independently. This played directly into Mongol strengths. The Mongols didn't scatter to fight individual duels. They formed up, advanced in disciplined units, and destroyed the Japanese forces one by one. Let's talk about what this fighting actually looked like. A samurai would ride forward, shout his name and lineage, challenge an enemy warrior to combat. The Mongols would ignore him and shoot him with dozens of arrows from multiple directions simultaneously. If the samurai survived the arrow storm and closed the distance, he'd find himself facing not one opponent, but a coordinated unit fighting as a group, supported by archers and infantry with polearms. Samurai swords and personal combat skills were useless against this. The Mongols used weapons the Japanese had never seen. They had crossbows, not common in Japan, which could punch through armor at close range. They had polearms designed for formation fighting, not individual dueling, and they had bombs. These were ceramic or iron shells filled with gunpowder, with a fuse that was lit and then thrown or launched from catapults. When they exploded, they created noise, fire, and shrapnel that killed or terrified horses. The Japanese had no experience with explosives. The first time a bomb went off near a group of samurai, their horses panicked and bolted. This wasn't cowardice. This was animals reacting to a sound and sensation they'd never encountered. The Mongols exploited this ruthlessly, using bombs to break up samurai charges before they could reach the Mongol lines. The initial engagements around Hakata were disasters for the Japanese. Samurai forces charged, were shot apart by massed archery, disrupted by bombs, and then overwhelmed by disciplined Mongol units. Casualties were heavy, bodies piled up on the beaches and roads leading inland from Hakata. Some samurai retreated in panic. Others fought to the death, refusing to dishonor themselves by fleeing, and were killed to the last man for no strategic gain. By the afternoon of November 20th, the Mongols controlled Hakata and the surrounding area. They'd pushed several miles inland, destroying every Japanese force they encountered. The invasion was succeeding exactly as planned. Kyushu should fall within days. Japan should be conquered within months. But something was starting to go wrong for the Mongols. The Japanese were learning. The samurai who survived the initial engagements brought back information. The Mongols fought in groups, not individually. They used massed archery, not single combat. Their armor was lighter than samurai armor, but their tactics made up for it. Charging them directly was suicide, so the Japanese started adapting. Instead of riding out to challenge enemies to honorable combat, they started using ambushes. Small groups of samurai would hide in forests or behind terrain, wait for Mongol units to pass, then attack from the sides or rear, and retreat before the Mongols could form up and respond. This was dishonorable by Japanese standards. Ambushes and hit-and-run attacks were the tactics of bandits, not warriors, but they worked. The Japanese also started using the terrain. Northern Kyushu is mountainous with narrow valleys and dense forests. The Mongols were plains warriors, accustomed to open steppe where their cavalry could maneuver freely. In the broken terrain of Kyushu, their mobility advantage was reduced. The Japanese, who'd been fighting in these mountains for generations, knew every path, every ambush point, every defensible position. They started using that knowledge. By the evening of November 20th, the Mongol advance had slowed. They controlled Hakata and a few miles of surrounding territory, but expanding further was meeting unexpected resistance. Japanese forces weren't meeting them in open battle anymore. They were harassing supply lines, ambushing patrols, attacking at night, and disappearing into the countryside. The Mongols were taking casualties from an enemy they couldn't pin down and decisively defeat. The Mongol commanders held a council. They'd achieved their initial objectives. They'd landed successfully, established a beachhead, defeated the local forces in open combat, but they hadn't destroyed Japanese resistance. The enemy was still fighting, still dangerous, and adapting to Mongol tactics faster than expected. The fleet was anchored in Hakata Bay, exposed to weather and potential Japanese attack. Supplies were limited. They'd brought enough for a short campaign, expecting quick victory. If this turned into a prolonged fight, logistics became a problem. Some commanders argued for pushing inland immediately before the Japanese could organize a stronger defense. Others argued for consolidating the beachhead, bringing more supplies from Korea, and launching a larger offensive. While the Mongols debated, the Japanese were organizing. Hojo Tokimune, back in Kamakura, had ordered every samurai family in Kyushu to mobilize. Reinforcements were arriving from across the island, converging on the area around Hakata. The Japanese were still outnumbered, still outmatched in open combat, but they were no longer scattered and panicked. They were forming an actual defensive strategy. On November 21st, the second day of fighting, the Mongols attempted to expand their perimeter. They sent columns inland, trying to secure more territory and engage the Japanese forces they knew were gathering. This is where the Battle of Torikai-Gata begins. Torikai-Gata was a plain or field a few miles inland from Hakata. The exact location is disputed by historians, but it was apparently open ground suitable for cavalry operations, which the Mongols preferred. A large Mongol force, several thousand men including cavalry, infantry, and archers, advanced toward Torikai-Gata, where Japanese forces had assembled. The Japanese force was a coalition of samurai families from across Kyushu, perhaps 3,000 to 5,000 men, commanded by various local lords. There was no unified command structure. Each lord commanded his own retainers. Coordination was loose at best. This should have been another Mongol victory. They had superior tactics, better coordination, and more combat experience. But the Japanese had spent the last 24 hours learning painful lessons. They weren't going to charge headlong into Mongol formations anymore. The battle opened with the Mongols advancing in formation, cavalry on the flanks, infantry in the center, archers behind ready to provide supporting fire. The Japanese didn't charge. They held their ground, using a low ridge and scattered trees as cover. When the Mongol cavalry tried to flank, Japanese archers, dismounted and using terrain for protection, shot at them from cover. This wasn't the devastating massed volley fire the Mongols used, but it was effective enough to disrupt the cavalry charge. The Mongol cavalry pulled back, regrouped, and tried a different approach. They sent infantry forward to engage the Japanese center, while cavalry circled wider to get behind the Japanese position. The Japanese responded by splitting their forces, some engaging the Mongol infantry, others moving to counter the flanking cavalry. The fighting became fragmented, breaking down into dozens of small engagements across the field. This played to Japanese strengths. In small unit combat, individual samurai skill mattered. A samurai on horseback with a bow could outfight a Mongol in single combat. The Mongols were better at coordinated unit tactics, but in broken, chaotic fighting where units got separated, that advantage diminished. The battle raged through the afternoon. Neither side could gain a decisive advantage. The Mongols would form up, advance, start to gain ground. Then Japanese counterattacks from unexpected directions would disrupt their formation and force them to regroup. The Japanese would push forward, drive the Mongols back, then get caught by Mongol archery or a cavalry charge and have to retreat. Casualties mounted on both sides. The Mongols lost hundreds of men. The Japanese lost hundreds of samurai, irreplaceable skilled warriors. Neither side was winning. Then the Mongols brought up their bombs. Mongol troops began hurling explosive devices into Japanese positions, creating chaos and terror. Horses panicked. Men were wounded by shrapnel. The noise and fire were overwhelming for warriors who'd never experienced anything like it. The Japanese lines started to waver. This was the moment the Mongols needed. They pressed forward, sensing the Japanese were about to break. A full cavalry charge, backed by infantry, pushing toward the shaken Japanese center. If it succeeded, the Japanese force would be routed, scattered, and destroyed in detail. But the Japanese didn't break. Individual samurai, seeing the charge coming, made desperate decisions. Some dismounted and used their horses as cover, shooting at the charging Mongols from behind their dead or dying mounts. Others charged directly into the Mongol cavalry, accepting death to disrupt the charge and buy time for others to retreat to better positions. Others led small groups in flanking attacks against the Mongol infantry, preventing them from supporting the cavalry. These weren't coordinated tactics. These were individual acts of courage by men who understood they were losing and chose to fight anyway. Enough of these individual actions, happening simultaneously across the battlefield, blunted the Mongol charge. The cavalry couldn't maintain momentum. The infantry couldn't advance. The Japanese line held barely. By late afternoon, both sides were exhausted. The Mongols pulled back to regroup. The Japanese, bloodied and shaken, held their positions but didn't pursue. Both armies stared at each other across a field covered with bodies, knowing that another major engagement would be catastrophic for whoever lost. The Mongol commanders faced a decision. They'd taken heavy casualties. The Japanese were still fighting, still organized, and showing no signs of surrender. The fleet was still anchored in Hakata Bay, vulnerable. Supplies were running low. It was late November, and storms were a constant threat in these waters. Some of the Korean sailors were warning that the weather was turning, that they needed to return to Korea before winter storms made the crossing impossible. The Mongols held another council. Some commanders wanted to press the attack, bring up more troops from the fleet, overwhelm the Japanese through sheer numbers. Others wanted to withdraw to the ships, resupply, and return in the spring with a larger force. The decision was complicated by reports from scouts that more Japanese reinforcements were arriving from the south and east. Every hour they delayed, the Japanese got stronger. Every hour they delayed, the weather got worse. At some point during the night of November 21st or early morning of November 22nd, the Mongol commanders decided to withdraw. This wasn't a rout. This was an organized tactical withdrawal. The Mongol forces pulled back to Hakata, then began embarking on their ships. The Japanese, exhausted and disorganized, didn't seriously contest the withdrawal. Some samurai harassed the Mongol rearguard, but there was no major engagement. By the evening of November 22nd, most of the Mongol invasion force was back on the ships. The fleet prepared to depart. Then that night or early the next morning, a storm hit. The chronicles call it a great storm, possibly a typhoon. The Mongol fleet, anchored in an exposed harbor, was devastated. Hundreds of ships were sunk, driven onto rocks, or capsized. Thousands of Mongol, Chinese, and Korean soldiers drowned. The survivors fled back to Korea in whatever ships remained seaworthy. Contemporary sources claim that up to 13,000 men were lost to the storm, though modern historians think that's an exaggeration. But even conservative estimates suggest thousands died. The invasion was over. The Mongols had landed, won most of their engagements, pushed inland, and then withdrawn in the face of unexpected resistance and deteriorating weather. The storm destroyed what was left of their fleet. They wouldn't return for 7 years. In Japan, the storm was credited to divine intervention. The kami, the Shinto gods, had sent the wind to protect Japan. The storm became known as the kamikaze, the divine wind. This mythology would persist for centuries, eventually giving its name to the suicide pilots of World War II. But let's be clear about what actually happened. The Mongols withdrew before the storm hit. They withdrew because the campaign wasn't going as planned, because casualties were higher than expected, because supplies were low, and because the weather was turning. The storm destroyed the fleet after the decision to leave had already been made. It prevented the Mongols from returning later that season, but it didn't drive them away. Japanese resistance drove them away. The storm just made sure they couldn't come back quickly. So what actually happened at Torikai-Gata and in the broader campaign, the Mongols landed with overwhelming force and superior tactics. They destroyed the initial Japanese resistance, captured Hakata, and pushed inland. Then they met organized resistance from samurai who'd learned from their initial defeats and started using terrain, ambushes, and desperation to counter Mongol advantages. At Torikai-Gata, a major engagement ended inconclusively, with both sides bloodied and exhausted. The Mongols, facing logistics problems, unexpected casualties, and worsening weather, withdrew. The storm destroyed their fleet and prevented an immediate return. The Japanese, through a combination of adaptation, terrain advantage, and sheer stubborn refusal to accept defeat, had survived the first Mongol invasion. Let's talk about the aftermath. The Mongols returned to Korea, having failed to conquer Japan, but having learned valuable lessons about Japanese defenses and tactics. Kublai Khan was not a man who accepted failure. He immediately ordered preparations for a second, larger invasion. The Japanese, for their part, understood how close they'd come to disaster. The Mongols had landed, defeated them repeatedly in open battle, and only withdrawn because of logistics and weather. If the Mongols returned with a larger force, better supplies, and better planning, Japan would fall. Hojo Tokimune ordered the construction of a massive defensive wall along the coast of Hakata Bay. This wall, built over the next several years, was several miles long and several meters high, designed to prevent enemy landings and provide fortified positions for defenders. It was one of the largest construction projects in medieval Japanese history. Samurai families were taxed and required to provide labor. The wall was completed by 1276. Tokimune also reformed military training and organization. Samurai were taught to fight in coordinated units, not just individual combat. They practiced against massed archery. They developed tactics specifically designed to counter Mongol cavalry and formations. The lessons of 1274 were institutionalized. In Korea and China, the Mongols prepared for a second invasion. They built a much larger fleet, assembled a much larger army, and planned a two-pronged assault from Korea and southern China simultaneously. This second invasion would land in 1281, 7 years after the first, with over 4,000 ships and somewhere between 70,000 and 140,000 men, depending on which source you trust. It was the largest amphibious invasion in history until the 20th century. And it would also fail, but that's a different story. The second invasion is famous because of the second divine wind, the typhoon that destroyed the Mongol fleet in 1281 and ended any chance of conquering Japan. But the first invasion, in 1274, is where the real story is. That's where the Japanese learned they could resist. That's where samurai warfare evolved from ritualized individual combat to coordinated defensive tactics. That's where the Mongols learned that Japan wouldn't be an easy conquest. Let me circle back to Torikai-Gata specifically. What happened there that made it significant? It was the largest engagement of the 1274 invasion, the moment when a major Mongol force met organized Japanese resistance and failed to achieve a decisive victory. It wasn't a Japanese victory in the traditional sense. The Japanese didn't drive the Mongols from the field. They didn't capture Mongol commanders or break the invasion force, but they survived. They held their ground, took terrible casualties, and remained an organized fighting force. For the Mongols, who were accustomed to sweeping victories, who expected to scatter the samurai in the first major battle, this was a shock. They won tactically, controlled the battlefield at the end of the day, but hadn't achieved their operational objectives. The Japanese were still fighting. The invasion was stalling. Torikai-Gata was the moment the Mongol invasion lost its momentum. After that battle, the Mongols were on the defensive psychologically. They were worried about supplies, worried about weather, worried about the increasing numbers of Japanese forces arriving from the south. The decision to withdraw followed directly from the realization that this wasn't going to be quick or easy. So why don't we hear more about Torikai-Gata in Western histories? Because it wasn't a decisive battle in the traditional sense. No one surrendered, no major city was captured or lost. The fighting was confused and inconclusive, and it was overshadowed by the storm that destroyed the fleet a few days later. The storm made a better story. Divine intervention, the gods protecting Japan, the mystical divine wind. That's the narrative that stuck. But the reality is more interesting. The reality is that Japanese warriors, facing the most advanced military force in the world, learned in real time how to fight a new kind of war. They abandoned their traditional honor code when it became a death sentence. They used terrain, ambushes, and desperation instead of glorious charges. They suffered terrible casualties but maintained cohesion. And they forced the Mongols to choose between escalating commitment to a difficult campaign or withdrawing to fight another day. The Mongols chose withdrawal. That was the victory, such as it was. Now let's talk about the individual experiences. The Japanese chronicles from this period, written by samurai families, are full of personal accounts of the 1274 invasion. These accounts are propaganda, designed to emphasize the courage and loyalty of particular families, but they also contain real details about what the fighting was like. One samurai, Takesaki Tsunaga, actually commissioned a painted scroll depicting his experiences fighting the Mongols. The scroll shows Mongol soldiers in formation, firing arrows in volleys, throwing bombs. It shows Takesaki charging alone, getting shot by multiple arrows, surviving through a combination of armor and luck. It shows the chaos of battle, horses falling, men dying, the confusion and terror. Takesaki's scroll is one of the most important primary sources for understanding what Mongol warfare looked like from the Japanese perspective. Another account describes a samurai named Shoni Kagesyuk, who led forces in the defense of Hakata. Kagesyuk organized ambushes and night raids against Mongol positions, tactics that were considered dishonorable but effective. After the war, he had to defend his actions to the shogunate, explaining that he'd done what was necessary to stop the invasion, even if it violated traditional warrior codes. He was ultimately vindicated, and his tactics became standard doctrine. These personal accounts reveal the psychological trauma of the invasion. Samurai were trained from childhood to value honor, courage, and individual glory. The Mongol invasion forced them to abandon those values to survive. Men who'd spent their lives preparing for honorable single combat found themselves hiding in forests, shooting at enemies from ambush, running away from battles they couldn't win. This created a cognitive dissonance that many struggled with for years afterward. Some samurai refused to adopt the new tactics and died honorably in suicidal charges. Others adapted and survived, but felt ashamed. The invasion forced Japanese warrior culture to evolve or die. For the Mongols and Koreans, the invasion was a frustrating failure. They de-assembled a massive fleet, crossed dangerous waters, landed successfully, won most of their engagements, and still failed to conquer the enemy. The Korean sailors and soldiers who'd been conscripted into this campaign against their will had suffered terribly. Thousands died in the storm. Survivors returned to Korea with horror stories about the sea voyage, the fighting, and the storm that destroyed the fleet. These stories discouraged future invasions, though Kublai Khan ignored them and ordered the second invasion anyway. The Chinese and Mongol soldiers had expected an easy campaign against a primitive island nation. Instead, they'd met fierce resistance, difficult terrain, and a storm that killed thousands. Some of the Mongol commanders reported back that Japan could be conquered, but it would require a much larger force and better logistics than they'd had in 1274. This information shaped the planning for the 1281 invasion, which brought over 100,000 men and better supplies. But the fundamental problem remained. Japan was an island nation, difficult to invade, with a warrior culture that fought ferociously when threatened. The Mongols could win battles, but conquering and holding the entire country would require a prolonged occupation that would drain resources needed elsewhere in the empire. Let's talk about why the Mongols failed in 1274 and why that matters. The Mongols had conquered vast territories in Asia and Europe using the same basic playbook. Invade with overwhelming force, win a decisive battle that breaks enemy resistance, capture the capital, install a puppet government, and move on. It worked against the Jin dynasty, the Song dynasty, the Khwarazmian Empire, and dozens of smaller kingdoms. It didn't work against Japan. Why? First, geography. Japan is an island. The Mongols were land-based power. Even their cavalry depended on continuous supply lines over land. Naval invasions require ships, sailors, and logistics that are fundamentally different from land campaigns. The Mongols had to rely on Korean and Chinese shipwrights and sailors who didn't have experience with large-scale amphibious operations. The fleet in 1274 was adequate for the crossing but not built for long-term operations or bad weather. Second, Japanese resistance. The samurai were outmatched in the first engagements, but they didn't collapse. They retreated, learned, adapted, and came back. This resilience, this refusal to accept defeat even after catastrophic losses, meant the Mongols couldn't win a quick, decisive victory. And without a quick victory, the invasion became a war of attrition the Mongols weren't prepared for. Third, terrain. Kyushu is mountainous, forested, with limited open ground suitable for Mongol cavalry tactics. The Mongols couldn't use their mobility advantage effectively. Japanese forces could retreat into mountains, launch ambushes, and avoid decisive battles. The terrain favored the defender. Fourth, weather. The Mongol invasion happened in late November, near the end of the campaign season. Winter storms in the Korean Strait are notoriously dangerous. The Mongol commanders knew this, which limited their operational window. They needed to win quickly before weather made staying impossible. When they didn't win quickly, weather forced the decision to withdraw. Fifth, logistics. The Mongol force in 1274 brought limited supplies, expecting to resupply from captured Japanese territory. When Japanese resistance prevented them from securing enough territory to forage or establish supply bases, they ran into shortages. There's evidence that by the second day of fighting, some Mongol units were already rationing food. Sixth, strategic overstretch. The Mongol Empire in 1274 was fighting wars on multiple fronts. Campaigns in southern China against the Song dynasty, conflicts in Central Asia, border skirmishes in Eastern Europe. The Japanese invasion was important but not critical. If it required too many resources or took too long, Kublai Khan would have to divert forces to more pressing theaters. This limited how much the Mongols could commit to Japan. All these factors combined to create a situation where the Mongols could land, could win battles, but couldn't achieve their strategic objective of conquering Japan. The invasion stalled, and when it stalled, it failed. Now let's talk about the long-term significance. The Mongol invasions of 1274 and 1281 are foundational events in Japanese history. They created a national identity based on resisting foreign invasion. The myth of the divine wind, the idea that Japan was protected by the gods, became central to Japanese self-conception for centuries. During World War II, this myth was weaponized to justify suicide attacks, with pilots literally named kamikaze after the divine wind that saved Japan in 1281. But the real legacy of 1274 is more subtle. It forced Japanese military culture to modernize. The samurai class, which had been focused on individual honor and ritualized combat, learned to fight as coordinated units using tactics designed to win rather than to look glorious. This evolution made Japanese armies more effective in later conflicts. The defensive wall, built after 1274, became a model for coastal fortifications throughout Japan. The idea of building permanent defenses against invasion, rather than relying on meeting enemies in open battle, changed Japanese strategic thinking. The experience of facing a technologically superior enemy who fought in unfamiliar ways prepared Japan, psychologically at least, for later encounters with foreign powers. When Europeans arrived in the 16th century with guns and different military doctrines, the Japanese were able to adapt more quickly than many other cultures because they'd already been through this once. For the Mongol Empire, the failed Japanese invasions were a minor setback in the grand scheme. The Mongols continued to dominate Asia for another century, but Japan remained unconquered, one of the few major territories in Asia that the Mongols never controlled. This fact, this one failure, loomed large in Mongol consciousness. It suggested limits to Mongol power, limits that hadn't been apparent before. The failure to conquer Japan, combined with other setbacks in Southeast Asia and the Middle East, marked the end of Mongol expansion and the beginning of the empire's long, slow decline. For military historians, the 1274 invasion is fascinating because it shows what happens when two radically different military systems collide. The Mongols represented the cutting edge of 13th century military technology and tactics. The Japanese represented a feudal warrior culture based on individual honor. The clash should have been one-sided. It wasn't because the Japanese adapted faster than the Mongols expected and because terrain and logistics favored the defender. The Battle of Torikai-Gata specifically demonstrates the limits of tactical superiority. The Mongols were better tacticians, better organized, better equipped. They should have won decisively. But in broken terrain, against a desperate enemy willing to die rather than surrender, fighting on their home ground, the Mongol advantages were reduced. Not eliminated, the Mongols still won most engagements, but reduced enough that they couldn't achieve their operational objectives. This is a lesson that echoes through military history. Superior forces can be stymied by inferior forces defending favorable terrain with determination. It happened to the Mongols in Japan. It happened to the Americans in Vietnam. It happened to the Soviets in Afghanistan. The specific circumstances differ, but the pattern is consistent. Tactical superiority doesn't guarantee strategic victory. Let me address the mythology around this battle. There's a popular narrative, especially in Japanese nationalist histories, that frames the Mongol invasions as a clash between Japanese spirit and foreign barbarism. In this narrative, the brave samurai, through superior courage and moral purity, defeated the godless Mongols, and the divine wind confirmed Japan's special status as a land protected by the gods. This narrative is mostly bullshit. The Mongols weren't barbarians. They were the most sophisticated military force in the world, with advanced tactics, logistics, and technology. They'd conquered civilizations far more advanced than 13th century Japan. The samurai weren't mystical warriors with supernatural abilities. They were feudal cavalry, skilled in traditional warfare, but completely unprepared for the kind of war the Mongols fought. What actually happened was that a technologically inferior force, fighting on home terrain with the advantage of interior lines and motivated by existential fear, managed to survive long enough for logistics and weather to force the invaders to withdraw. That's not divine intervention. That's the reality of pre-modern warfare. The storm that destroyed the Mongol fleet was weather, not gods. Typhoons hit the Korean Strait regularly in late autumn. The Mongol commanders knew the risk, which is why they were worried about weather from the start. The storm was significant because it came at exactly the moment it could do maximum damage, when the fleet was loaded with troops trying to evacuate. But it was chance, not divine will. The real story is more interesting than the myth. The real story is about adaptation under pressure, about a warrior culture forced to evolve or die, about the limits of military power when facing a determined enemy on difficult terrain. That story doesn't need gods or mystical wind. It just needs recognition that humans under extreme stress can do extraordinary things. Okay, let's wrap this up. What actually happened at Torikai-Gata and in the 1274 Mongol invasion of Japan? The Mongols assembled the largest invasion fleet Asia had seen to that point and sailed to Japan with 40,000 men. They landed at Hakata Bay, crushed initial Japanese resistance, and pushed inland. The Japanese, learning quickly that their traditional tactics were suicide against Mongol formations, adapted. They used terrain, ambushes, and hit-and-run tactics. At Torikai-Gata, a large Mongol force met organized Japanese resistance in a major engagement that ended inconclusively. Both sides took heavy casualties. Neither achieved their objectives. The Mongols, facing logistics problems and worsening weather, withdrew to their ships and evacuated. A storm hit during the evacuation, destroying much of the fleet and killing thousands. The invasion failed. The Japanese survived. 7 years later, the Mongols returned with an even larger force and failed again, this time definitely because of a typhoon that destroyed the entire fleet. The myth of the divine wind was born, obscuring the reality that Japanese resistance, not divine intervention, had forced the Mongols to withdraw in 1274. The legacy of Torikai-Gata and the 1274 invasion is the evolution of Japanese warfare from ritualized individual combat to coordinated defensive tactics. It's the construction of the defensive wall at Hakata. It's the psychological impact of surviving the most powerful military force in the world. It's the foundation of Japanese national identity as a people who resist foreign conquest. And it's a case study in how inferior forces can survive against superior enemies through adaptation, terrain advantage, and refusal to surrender. If this story taught you something, if you understand the Mongol invasions of Japan better now, if you see the complexity beyond the myth of the divine wind, hit that like button and tell me in the comments. Tell me what you think about this battle. Tell me if you want more stories about military conflicts where the underdog survives through adaptation rather than divine intervention. Share this video if you think others should know what actually happened when the Mongols invaded Japan. Subscribe if you want more history that respects your intelligence, that doesn't rely on myths and simplifications, that tells you what happened and why it matters without the mystical nonsense. The Battle of Torikai-Gata happened. Thousands of samurai faced tens of thousands of Mongol warriors. The fighting was brutal, inconclusive, and tactically innovative. The Japanese survived. The Mongols withdrew. A storm finished what Japanese resistance had started. That's history, not divine wind, not mystical protection, not racial superiority. Just men fighting desperately on difficult terrain, learning as they fought, surviving when they should have been destroyed. That's the real story of how the samurai defeated the Mongols, not through superior virtue or divine favor, but through adaptation, terrain, and stubborn refusal to accept the inevitable. Thank you for watching. Remember this battle. Remember what it teaches about adaptation under pressure, about the limits of tactical superiority, about how geography and logistics can defeat the most powerful armies. Remember that myths are comforting, but reality is more interesting. See you in the next one.